Welcome to Life Stories, where real-life experiences unfold in the most unexpected ways. Today's story is one of survival, betrayal, and redemption. It's about a young woman who, abandoned by her family, was left to fend for herself on the streets. Through grit, determination, and a little help from a stranger, she not only rebuilt her life but returned to expose the dark secrets of those who once cast her aside. This is a story of reclaiming power, finding your voice, and rising above the ashes. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. I still remember the coldness of that day, the way the wind sliced through my skin like shards of glass. Sharp and unforgiving. It was the winter I had just turned 17. The year I was thrown out of my home, forced into the world with nothing but a tattered backpack, a few worn clothes, and $14.82. My family's home, the one I had grown up in, was a place that no longer welcomed me. That was the first time I understood that I wasn't truly seen by the people who should have cared for me the most. The echoes of my mother's voice still haunt me, her words sharp and cutting. Why is she here? I could hear the disdain in her tone even before I walked into the grand foyer. My father, without a single glance in my direction, remained motionless, indifferent to my presence, while my sister Sarah stood beside him, her arms crossed, her lips curled into a sneer. She was the golden child, the one they always adored, the one who could do no wrong. And there I stood, forgotten, invisible, a burden they had long wished to rid themselves of. No one even acknowledged me. No one asked me why I was standing there, looking for some semblance of love or compassion. My existence was an inconvenience to them, a stain that needed to be erased. And so, without a word of goodbye, without a second glance, they kicked me out. The harsh winter air bit at my skin as I stood in front of the colonial-style mansion, the only home I had ever known, watching the door close behind me with a finality that took my breath away. My mother stood at the window, a glass of red wine in her hand, her eyes distant, as if I were no more than a passing inconvenience, a debt that had finally been paid. My father, as usual, said nothing, simply handing me the cold, cutting words. You're grown now, Grace. Go take care of yourself. The door slammed behind me, and I walked away without looking back. I promised myself I would never beg, that I would never let them see how deeply their rejection cut me. I couldn't let them have that power over me. Not anymore. I walked down the frozen streets, the world around me a blur of bitter cold and loneliness. I was afraid to look back, afraid I would break down and beg for their love. But I knew I couldn't do that. Not after everything. That night, I found myself on the streets of downtown, shivering behind a bus stop, trying to find some shelter from the wind. My stomach growled with hunger. My body ached with exhaustion. But I didn't cry. Tears would freeze before they even reached my cheeks. The cold, the hunger, the isolation, they were all a part of my new reality now. But I wasn't going to break. I refused to. The next day, I wandered the streets in search of something, anything, that could offer me a way out of this nightmare. I tried looking for a job, but without an address, without identification, no one would even consider me. My stomach ached as I walked past bakeries, coffee shops, places that once felt like home to me. But no one wanted to hire a girl like me, someone with no name, no past, nothing but the ragged clothes on her back. That second night, I found a spot behind a dumpster near McKinley's Deli. It wasn't warm, but at least it was a little sheltered. I curled up in my hoodie, clutching my backpack to my chest as though it held the last piece of my childhood. The wind howled, the city hummed with life, but all I could hear was the deafening silence of abandonment. I knew I could be robbed, assaulted, or worse, but I had no other choice. I lay there, my body pressed against the cold concrete, my mind racing. How had I come to this? A year ago, I had been a daughter, loved, wanted, and now I was nothing more than a shadow, forgotten by the very people who had once claimed to love me. But in that moment, I also knew something else. I knew that I wasn't going to let this defeat me. I was going to survive. I had to. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would fight. I would find a way to start over. And I wouldn't need anyone's help to do it. The next few days passed in a haze of desperation. But there was one thing I knew. I had to keep going. I wasn't ready to break. Not yet. The world had treated me like I was invisible. But I was still here. Still breathing. I found myself walking the streets each morning, hunting for any chance of a way out. I found nothing. At least not until Ruby came into my life. It was the third day. The day I almost gave up. I had been rejected by a bakery, turned away from a coffee shop, and had nowhere to go. My stomach growled in protest. The hunger pangs so sharp I could hardly think. I knew I had to keep moving. But I had no idea where to go. That's when I saw her. Ruby Delaney. She was standing in the back of her diner, holding a ladle, her eyes locking onto mine as I passed by the open kitchen door. She didn't look at me like everyone else had, with disdain or indifference, but with a quiet understanding. Like she had seen me before. Her voice called out, sharp and firm, "What are you doing here?" I froze. I was ready to turn and walk away, to keep my head down and go back to the streets. But something in her voice made me stop. Something in her eyes made me stay. "Are you planning to sleep behind my kitchen?" she asked. "You might as well mop the floor first." I didn't know how to respond. I stood there for a moment, caught between the shame of my situation and the surprising warmth in her gaze. But before I could answer, Ruby gestured to a tray of food on the counter. A warm, steaming plate of chicken stir-fry noodles. "Eat first, then work," she said, handing me a mop. I was speechless. No one had treated me like this in days. Not since my family had abandoned me. No one had offered me kindness. No one had seen me. But Ruby didn't ask where I had come from or why I was there. She simply offered me a job and a meal. I ate, not because I was starving, but because for the first time in days, I felt human again. I felt like I mattered. After I finished the food, I got to work, mopping the floors of Ruby's diner, scrubbing dishes, and taking out the trash. The work was exhausting, but it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: purpose. I worked all night, the sound of the mop against the floor a steady rhythm. And by the time I was done, Ruby pointed to the back storage room. "There's an old mattress in the corner. Not the cleanest, but better than the floor," she said. I didn't have to be told twice. I was so tired that all I could do was crawl into the small corner and collapse onto the mattress. It wasn't much, but it was a bed. For the first time in days, I slept without fear of freezing to death in the streets. The next morning, Ruby didn't say anything about me sleeping in her back room. Instead, she tossed me a mop and said, "Get to work, eat later." I worked from dawn until the last customer left. Scrubbing, cleaning, mopping, never stopping. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. And for the first time in a long time, I felt useful. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know how long I could survive living like this. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this break me. Ruby had shown me kindness when I had nothing left to give. And that was enough for me to keep going. By the end of the week, Ruby gave me an old uniform shirt and a cracked plastic name tag that read, "Grace, Kitchen Assistant." I stared at the name tag. Not because it was anything special, but because it was the first time in months that I had felt like I had a place, a role, and a name again. I wasn't invisible anymore. Ruby never offered me praise or recognition. But she didn't have to. Her quiet support, the small gestures like leaving a towel or a box of bandages for my aching hands, spoke volumes. In her eyes, I wasn't a burden. I wasn't someone to be looked down upon. I was just another person, trying to survive, trying to make it, and that was enough. Years passed, and my life slowly began to shift. With Ruby's quiet encouragement, I fought my way through each day, putting in the hours at the diner and clawing my way to an education. By the time I turned 18, I had earned my GED. But that was just the beginning. The truth was, I had never planned to stop there. I knew I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life scrubbing floors. I wasn't just a waitress or a kitchen assistant. I was Grace, and I had something bigger in mind. Ruby, ever the quiet observer, had given me the foundation I needed. She had seen something in me that even I had trouble recognizing at the time. She handed me the keys to a small room upstairs. The one I would now use to study in peace. Away from the busy hum of the diner. She said, "You're not a bad kid. You just got kicked out of the nest earlier than most." I didn't know what that meant at first. But I understood soon enough. I wasn't lost. I was just finding my way. When I applied to Central Oregon Community College and got accepted, I felt the rush of 1,000 emotions: pride, disbelief, hope, but most of all, I felt alive. I was ready for something more. I was going to be more than the girl they had kicked to the curb. I wasn't just going to survive, I was going to thrive. And that's exactly what I did. Years later, I walked across the graduation stage with a business degree in hand. It wasn't the most glamorous of ceremonies, no family, no cheering crowd, but I had something better. I had my freedom. I had worked for every inch of it. And I had earned it. It was mine, and nothing could take it from me. But there was one thing left. One thing that still haunted me, lingering in the back of my mind: my family. I had spent so many years trying to forget them, trying to build a life that didn't involve their cruelty, their rejection. But the truth was, I couldn't completely escape. There was unfinished business. When Sarah got engaged, I knew it was time. I knew that the girl who had been abandoned, the girl they had thrown out like trash, had become someone they could no longer ignore. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't interested in dragging them down. But they needed to see who I had become. They needed to know that I wasn't the same girl who had walked away from their cold mansion all those years ago. The engagement party was held at the Ashbury Grand Hotel, a place that felt like a world I no longer belonged to. But this time, I wasn't the forgotten daughter in the corner. This time, I was the one standing in the spotlight. I walked through the doors, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Every step a reminder that I had come full circle. I had arrived, and I wasn't leaving without making my point. As soon as my mother laid eyes on me, her face twisted into that familiar expression of disdain. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice cracking like a whip through the air. It was as if nothing had changed. As if I were still that same girl they had discarded all those years ago. But I wasn't. I stood tall, my gaze steady, unwavering. "I'm here to congratulate you," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Congratulations on your engagement." My words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, like a knife waiting to be unsheathed. Without another word, I reached into my clutch and pulled out a black envelope, sealed with red wax. I handed it to Sarah's fiancé, Lucas. His confused expression melted into something darker as he opened it, his face draining of color. I watched as he read the contents, his hands trembling. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Tell me what this is." Sarah's face contorted with anger as she tried to snatch the papers from his hand. But it was too late. The truth was already out. The room erupted in shock and whispers. The papers revealed that Sarah, the girl my parents had always believed in, had never finished medical school. She had dropped out in her second year, never earning the degree she had claimed. The golden child had been exposed for the fraud she truly was. But I wasn't done yet. I had more to show, more to expose. As the room erupted into chaos, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. My parents, once so powerful, once so untouchable, now stood crumbling before the truth. My mother's face had drained of color, her mouth moving but no words coming out. My father, ever the stoic figure, had nothing left to say. And Sarah, my sister, who had once mocked my struggles, was now a mere shadow of the person she had once been. Her pride shattered before the very people who had adored her. I didn't care about revenge. I didn't want their apologies or their hollow words. What I wanted was for the truth to be known. They had tried to erase me from their lives. But I had come back not to beg for a place at their table, but to burn it down completely. As I stood there, facing the wreckage of my family. I knew this was the final chapter. The lies, the deceit, the years of pain, they were all laid bare for the world to see. I had survived not because of them, but in spite of them. And now, with everything exposed, I could finally walk away, free from the past that had once defined me. The silence in the room was deafening. I turned and walked out, each step filled with purpose, leaving behind the family that had once tried to break me. As I stepped into the cool night, I felt a sense of peace settle within me, knowing that the battle was over. I had won. For the first time in years, I could finally breathe. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful life stories.